Chapter 8. The Statin Deception. Stephanie Seneff always wanted to be a biologist. For as long as she can remember, she's been fascinated by how things work, particularly how living things work. She wanted to know how frogs jump, how grasshoppers breathe, how cells communicate, how the heart talks to the brain, all of which scientists study in detail, frequently by spending hours a day peering into a microscope. She was interested in systems, and to her the human body was the most fascinating system of all. So she was more than a little delighted when, after high school, she was accepted into the biology program at MIT. After completing her BS in biophysics, she entered the MIT PhD program and spent a year working under Professor Harvey Lodish in the laboratory headed by future Nobel Prize winner David Baltimore. But there was a problem. After a year in Baltimore's lab, Seneff realized two things. One, she wasn't really cut out for the isolation required by a life in a lab. And two, she wanted to start a family. So she quit the PhD program. But she didn't quit MIT. In those days, she told us, you could get a job as a programmer with no prior experience. I got a job at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, where I lucked into a group of pioneers in the fledgling field of computer speech processing. Voila! Seneff found a home, a perfect blend of her two great interests, biology and computer dialogue systems. She went on to earn a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT, ultimately publishing more than 170 papers and becoming one of the world's leading experts in blending biological systems with computer intelligence. It was her pioneering work in the field of voice recognition and computer systems that led to commercial applications such as Siri, the virtual assistant built into the iPhone. Then something happened. Seneff's husband was diagnosed with heart disease. His doctor put him on a high-dose statin, 4 times the usual dose, and told him it was imperative that he stay on it. If you go off this or even reduce the dosage, I can no longer be your doctor, his physician told him. Almost immediately, the side effects started. He developed debilitating shoulder problems, muscle aches and weakness. He could no longer open drawers or jars, cognitive and memory problems, and depression, something he had never experienced before. We all know what we do when we first get a diagnosis or are prescribed a medication we're not familiar with, or begin having a bunch of unexplained symptoms or side effects. We ask Dr. Google, which is exactly what Seneff did. Except Seneff, as you can probably imagine, is no ordinary Googler. She applied her not inconsiderable, methodologically precise skills as a researcher to the task at hand and proceeded to try to learn everything there was to learn about cholesterol, heart disease, and statin drugs. Understand now that she had not spent 4 years in medical school being subtly influenced by the drug companies, had not been a consultant to the pharmaceutical industry, had not been visited daily by a charming crew of pharmaceutical reps spinning industry-funded studies touting the benefits of their products. And she had not been paid hefty fees by those same pharmaceutical companies, the way Dr. Sinatra had been, to give educational lectures on behalf of their products, lectures that are little more than marketing tools disguised as scholarship. She had no agenda other than to help her husband to get well. Basically, she wasn't bought or influenced by or beholden to anyone in the heart disease, cholesterol, statin drug establishment. She had no preconceived ideas, either positive or negative, about what she'd find. Her research was motivated only by a desire to get her husband well, and by her lifelong interest in biology and nutrition. And let's remember that we're talking about someone who has a world-class ability to understand systems, theory, statistics, interpretation, experimental bias, confounding variables, and all the rest of the esoterica associated with evaluating studies. Here's what Seneff told us about statin drugs when we contacted her for this book. Statin drugs are toxic. I liken them to arsenic, which will slowly poison you over time. P.S. Seneff's husband terminated his statin therapy, and all of his symptoms disappeared. Needless to say, he also changed doctors. The next medical tragedy? Seneff has become one of the most respected and outspoken critics of the cholesterol hypothesis, and she's quite vocal about her opposition to statin drugs, which she believes are the next medical tragedy waiting to happen. Let's be clear. Although Seneff and other independent researchers are pretty unequivocal in their negative appraisal of statin drugs, we are not. We're a little more moderate. Neither of us believe that statin drugs are all bad. As mentioned earlier, Steve still prescribes them very occasionally in certain limited circumstances. That is, to middle-aged men who have had a previous heart attack and are at high risk for a second. Even Dwayne Gravelin, MD, perhaps the most outspoken critic of statins on the planet and author of Lipitor, Thief of Memory, lists low-dose statin therapy as one possible option for high-risk people. Statin drugs do some good in some circumstances, but their benefits and the circumstances in which they are appropriate are much more limited than the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors who buy into their talking points would have us believe. Furthermore, any good they may accomplish has almost nothing to do with cholesterol lowering, as you will soon see. Here's what's good about statin drugs. 1, they're mildly anti-inflammatory. They lower C-reactive protein, a protein in the blood that's an excellent measure of systemic inflammation. And 2, they decrease blood viscosity, making the blood less like ketchup and more like red wine. Many of the benefits seen with statins are almost surely related to these other actions of the drug, not to its fairly meaningless ability to lower cholesterol. In fact, that's why statins occasionally show up as beneficial for conditions that have absolutely nothing to do with cholesterol, including gum disease and sepsis, a complex inflammatory syndrome. When you finish reading this section, you may find that you agree with a growing number of health professionals who think that statin drugs would be even more effective if they didn't lower cholesterol. But we digress. If you still doubt that the cholesterol-lowering effect of statins is the least important thing they do, put on your detective thinking hat for a moment, do a thought exercise with us, and consider the following. Before the introduction of statin drugs in the 1990s, there were a number of studies done in which cholesterol was successfully lowered by other drugs, notably the class of drugs known as fibrates, the go-to treatment for high cholesterol before the near-universal switch to statins in the last decade of the 20th century. These drugs actually lowered cholesterol quite well, thank you very much. If lowering cholesterol does in fact prevent heart attacks or strokes, then we should see a significant reduction in heart attacks and strokes anytime we successfully lower it, regardless of the particular drug or diet used to accomplish this. But investigations of the cholesterol-lowering studies before the mainstream use of statin drugs showed quite the opposite. And there's proof, all cataloged, collected, and assembled in one place, thanks to a man named Russell Smith. Mevacor, a statin drug, was actually introduced in 1987, but statins didn't become popular until the 1990s. Dying with corrected cholesterol is not a successful outcome. Back in the late 1980s, Russell Smith, Ph.D., an American experimental psychologist with a strong background in physiology, math, and engineering, decided to write the most comprehensive and critical review of the diet heart disease literature yet seen. Published in 2 volumes that spanned more than 600 pages and contained 3,000 references, it was titled Diet, Blood Cholesterol, and Coronary Heart Disease, a critical review of the literature. In the vast majority of studies reviewed, there was no difference in the number of deaths between the group that lowered its cholesterol and the group that didn't. Then, in 1991, together with Edward Pinkney, MD, editor of 4 medical journals and former co-editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, Smith published a summary of this massive work in a book called The Cholesterol Conspiracy. Among many other things, Smith and Pinkney reviewed all of the cholesterol-lowering trials that had been done before 1991. The studies found that using drugs to lower cholesterol was quite effective at lowering cholesterol. The problem was that they weren't much good for anything else, for example, saving lives. If cholesterol lowering was in fact the holy grail of preventing heart disease and death, then we should expect the research to show a reduction in heart attacks, strokes, and deaths when cholesterol was effectively lowered, wouldn't we? Here's what Smith and Pinkney concluded. In the vast majority of the studies reviewed, there was no difference in the number of deaths between the group that lowered its cholesterol and the group that didn't. In fact, in a few cases, more people died in the group that lowered its cholesterol. Okay, so we've talked about 10 out of those 12 cholesterol-lowering trials. Pretty dismal results. But what about the remaining 2 trials? In these 2 trials, there were fewer deaths in the group treated with cholesterol-lowering drugs than in the control group. These 2 studies, accounting for only a sixth of the total number of drug studies conducted, were exactly the ones the cholesterol establishment seized on as proof of the link between cholesterol and heart disease. However, reported Smith and Pinckney, one of these trials was conducted by a pharmaceutical company, which evaluated its own cholesterol-lowering drug. The second trial involved an estrogen drug that produced more harm than good in 3 other trials. Therefore, both of these trials are suspect. Scorecard. Out of 12 studies, 10 showed no benefit. The 2 that did were both somewhat questionable. Choosing 1 or 2 studies that show a positive result and burying the ones that don't is a well-documented tactic of the pharmaceutical industry. It's akin to finding 2 white checkers in a bucket of black ones and then holding up the white ones claiming that's proof that all checkers are white. So let's review. Before the introduction of statin drugs, it was overwhelmingly clear that lowering cholesterol by itself did virtually nothing to prevent a single death or even to affect coronary heart disease in any meaningful way. Zip. Nada. Zilch. Therefore, if any positive effects were to be seen in statin drug studies, these beneficial effects couldn't possibly be due to lowered cholesterol. As Smith and Pinckney conclusively demonstrate, all 30 or so studies completed before 1990 show that you could lower cholesterol to your heart's content without adding a single day to your life. John Abramson, MD, a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the author of Overdosed America, summed up the problem perfectly in the medical journal The Lancet. You can lower cholesterol with a drug, yet provide no health benefits whatsoever. And dying with corrected cholesterol is not a successful outcome. Statin drugs, risks versus benefits. Let's review. Lowering cholesterol, as the 30-some-odd studies before 1990 showed, accomplished nothing except, of course, to lower cholesterol. So, if there's a benefit to statin drugs at all, that benefit has to be coming from something other than their ability to lower cholesterol. Now, one might reasonably argue, so what? Suppose you're right that the ability of statin drugs to lower cholesterol is irrelevant, but suppose they do a lot of good anyway. Why not just use them for their other benefits? Good question. But to answer it, we need to know 2 things. 1, just how great a benefit are we actually talking about? And 2, what are the side effects? In simple terms, we want to know the same things we'd want to know about a financial investment. What are we risking versus what are we getting? With that in mind, let's take a look at the side effects of statin drugs you probably don't know about. No surprise, this is not exactly data that manufacturers of these drugs are dying to publicize. The dark side of statin drugs. Besides being far less effective than you've been led to believe, statins have myriad unpleasant and, in some cases, acute or even fatal side effects, such as many of those Seneff's husband experienced. These include muscle pain, weakness, fatigue, memory, and cognition problems, and, for a large number of people, very serious problems with sexual functioning. Statin drugs cut off cholesterol production in the body. That's pretty obvious, right? But to understand why the side effects of this seemingly innocent action are so severe and troubling, you have to understand exactly how statin drugs cut down on the body's production of cholesterol. When you do, you'll see that cutting off cholesterol production in the way that statin drugs do is like trying to kill a branch at the top of a tree by starving the roots. The side effect of starving the roots is that you don't just kill the branch, you destroy the tree. And the irony is that there was no need to remove the branch in the first place. Besides being far less effective than you've been led to believe, statins have myriad unpleasant and in some cases acute or even fatal side effects. Let us explain. Statin drugs and your brain, memory, thinking, and Alzheimer's. There are a number of unintended consequences of statin drugs you ought to know about. For one thing, statin drugs don't stop at just lowering cholesterol in the blood. They also lower it in the brain. And that's not good news. Why? Because the brain absolutely depends on cholesterol to function at its best. Although the brain makes up only about 2% of the total weight of the body, it contains 25% of the body's cholesterol. Cholesterol is a vital part of cell membranes in the brain, and it plays a critical role in the transmission of neurotransmitters. Without cholesterol, brain cells can't effectively talk to each other. Cellular communication is impaired, and cognition and memory are significantly affected, usually not in a good way. Cognitive and memory problems are one of the most dramatic and frequent side effects of statin drugs, and a 2009 study from Iowa State University demonstrates why. Yeon-Kyun Shin, Ph.D., a biophysics professor in the Department of Biochemistry, Biophysics, and Molecular Biology at Iowa State, tested the whole neurotransmitter machinery of brain cells in a novel experiment. Neurotransmitters affect data processing and memory functions in the brain. He measured how the system released neurotransmitters when cholesterol was removed from the cells and compared that with how the system functioned when cholesterol was put back in. Cholesterol increased protein function 5-fold. Our study shows there is a direct link between cholesterol and neurotransmitter release, said Shin. Cholesterol changes the shape of the protein to stimulate thinking and memory. In other words, how smart you are and how well you remember things. Adults should be no less sanguine. Speaking at a luncheon discussion put on by Project ALS, a nonprofit dedicated to raising money for brain research and the understanding of Lou Gehrig's disease, the vice chairman of medicine at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Orly Eddingen, MD, had this to say regarding the #1 selling statin drug in the world, Lipitor. This drug makes women stupid. Statin drugs and your energy. Here is one uncontroversial and incontrovertible fact. Statin drugs significantly deplete your body's stores of coenzyme Q10, CoQ10. If you don't already know what CoQ10 is, this would be a great time to become familiar with it. Once you understand the importance of CoQ10 to human health, you'll immediately appreciate why the depletion of CoQ10 by statin drugs is such a big deal. The depletion of CoQ10 is one of the most important negative effects of statins, and the one that is pretty much responsible for a host of common side effects involving muscle pain, weakness, and loss of energy. CoQ10 is a vitamin-like compound found in virtually every cell in the human body, and when your CoQ10 levels fall, so does your general health. CoQ10 is used in the energy-producing metabolic pathways of every cell. It's a powerful antioxidant, combating oxidative damage from free radicals and protecting your cell membranes, proteins, and DNA. In a previous book, Dr. Sinatra has referred to CoQ10 as the spark of life, and Dr. Johnny has written about it at length in the most effective natural cures on Earth. Without CoQ10, our bodies simply can't survive. The production of CoQ10 happens in one of the branches of the mevalonate pathway tree that is blocked by the action of statin drugs. When cholesterol production is interfered with in this way, so is the production of CoQ10. Interestingly, the most important muscle in the body, the heart, contains the greatest concentration of CoQ10. The severe reduction in CoQ10 caused by statin drugs damages not only the heart, but also the skeletal muscles that rely on CoQ10 for energy production. How ironic that a drug given to prevent heart disease, which it barely does, and then only in extremely limited circumstances, substantially weakens the very organ it's meant to protect. The fact that statin drugs cause depletion of CoQ10 levels has been known for decades. Merck, the manufacturer of Zocor, one of the best-selling statin drugs, has had a patent on a combination statin CoQ10 drug since around 1990, but never manufactured it. Although no one knows for sure why, it's widely believed that Merck never produced this drug because there was no real economic incentive to alerting the public to the CoQ10 problem and then solving it with a combo drug. No one else was doing it, so why should Merck bother? As we age, we make less CoQ10, so keeping what we have is even more important during our middle age and older years, when statin drugs are prescribed the most. Lower CoQ10 means less energy production for the heart and muscles. Stephanie Seneff and her associates at MIT collected a large number of subjective reports by patients on various drugs. They gathered more than 8,400 online reviews by patients on statin drugs and compared them for mentions of side effects with the same number of age-matched reviews randomly sampled from a broad spectrum of other drugs. To this day, many doctors are completely clueless about the CoQ10 connection and are unaware of its significance. One of us, Dr. Johnny, played tennis for years with a terrific 80-year-old named Marty. Although in great shape, Marty was always winded, had trouble catching his breath, and frequently experienced muscle pain and fatigue, which he and his doc attributed to getting older. It turns out that Marty's doctor had put him on a statin drug for his cholesterol. His symptoms marked a classic case of CoQ10 depletion. When Dr. Johnny pointed this out to him and suggested he immediately start supplementing with CoQ10, Marty said, "I'll ask my doctor about that." The doctor barely knew what CoQ10 was utterly clueless about its importance, and was completely unaware of this critically important side effect of the drug he had prescribed, a drug that was especially unnecessary in Marty's case, because high cholesterol is actually protective for older people. This, folks, is just one example of what we like to call cholesterol madness. If you are on a statin drug and need to remain on one for whatever reason, don't spend one more day without supplementing with CoQ10. Run. Don't walk to your nearest pharmacy or health food store and pick some up. We recommend a minimum of 100 milligrams twice a day of a highly bioavailable ubiquinone, or you can use the ubiquinol varietal. Statin drugs and your gut bugs. We've long known that antibiotics alter our gut microbiome, the massive and incredibly important collection of microbes inhabiting our colon. Hence the age-old advice to eat live cultured yogurt or take acidophilus tablets after a course of antibiotics. More recently, though, researchers have started exploring the effects of other drugs on our gut critters. One of those drugs is statins. So far, the news isn't good. The reason? Cholesterol is a precursor for bile acid production in our bodies, and taking statins is a surefire way to alter the size and composition of our bile acid pool. And it just so happens that bile acids play a big role in shaping the gut microbiome. In mice, 12 weeks of treatment with either pravastatin, Pravachol, or atorvastatin, Lipitor, significantly changed the animal's bile acid levels and reduced their diversity of gut bacteria, an indicator of disease. Reduced levels of butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid produced by fiber fermentation in the gut, and which plays a vital role in protecting against colon cancer, and overall changed the gut microbiome to resemble patterns similar to what we see with diet-induced obesity. In another study, treatment with Lipitor raised levels of the harmful microbe Desulfovibrio, often associated with inflammatory bowel disease. Although research on the effects of statins and gut bacteria in humans is still in its infancy, we suspect future findings will confirm that impaired or dysfunctional gut health is yet another causality of statin drugs. Statin drugs and immunity. NF-kappa B. As mentioned earlier, one of the good things about statin drugs is that they are anti-inflammatory. This is important and probably one of the main reasons statins show any of the benefit they sometimes do. Inflammation, as you learned in Chapter 5, is one of 4 major contributors to heart disease. We want our anti-inflammatory arsenal to be as powerful as possible because inflammation is a major component of every degenerative disease known to humankind. Anti-inflammatory foods, supplements, drugs, bring them on. So, the fact that statins are anti-inflammatory is a good thing, but the way they accomplish this anti-inflammatory action may not be without problems. They suppress chemicals in the body, such as NF-kappa B, based on the idea that these chemicals are bad actors that are associated with inflammation. The thinking seems to be, let's round those suckers up and march them the heck out of here. But the problem is that those chemicals aren't always bad. Like most of the humans we know, chemicals like NF-kappa B have bad sides and good sides. NF-kappa B, for example, helps protect against Salmonella and E. coli. That's a neat little benefit you don't want to lose just to get a mild anti-inflammatory effect that you could probably easily achieve by other methods, like taking fish oil, for example. And the impact of dramatically lowering cholesterol on the immune system is hardly limited to NF-kappa B. Research has shown that human LDL itself, the so-called bad cholesterol, is able to inactivate more than 90% of the worst and most toxic bacterial products. Space Doc, the strange case of the missing memory. In 2006, magician and performance artist David Blaine decided to do a stunt in which he was immersed in water for 7 days. To prepare for this grueling event, he decided to train with a man named Dwayne Gravelin. Gravelin has a particularly interesting resume. He's both an MD and an astronaut, one of 6 scientists selected by NASA for the Apollo program. He's also a renowned expert in the field of zero-gravity deconditioning research. The reason Blaine chose him as a consultant was because Gravelin himself had once spent 7 days immersed in water as part of his own zero-gravity conditioning program. Ask Gravelin how terrifying it was to be immersed in water for 7 days, and he'd probably tell you it was a walk in the park compared to what he went through when he suddenly lost his memory. Gravelin's story began in 1999, when he took his annual astronaut physical. The doctors said his cholesterol was too high and prescribed Lipitor, the biggest selling drug in the history of medicine. But shortly after starting the medication, Gravelin experienced a 6-hour episode of transient global amnesia, TGA. TGA is the medical term for a rare phenomenon that can last anywhere from 15 minutes to 12 hours. TGA sufferers suddenly lose the ability to retain new memory and often fail to recognize familiar surroundings. Often they can't even identify members of their own family, and they frequently become confused and disoriented. People experiencing TGA will literally regress in time, hours, days, weeks, or even years, and not have any memory of their life after the time they've regressed to. Following the episode, Gravelin discontinued the statin, but during his next physical, a year later, he was persuaded to restart the statin at half the previous dose. 2 months after doing so, he experienced another episode of TGA. This time it lasted for 12 hours. His awareness was tossed back 56 years to when he was 13 years old. He knew the names of every teacher and kid in his classes, but he had no memory of his subsequent life. He didn't even recognize his wife, who was with him when the incident occurred. Decades had been erased from his mind as if they had never happened. Fortunately, the amnesia lifted, and his memory reverted back to normal. He stopped taking the statin again, too, this time for good. Gravelin began his own personal search for the facts about statins, and what he found was more than a little disturbing. He learned that TGA had befallen hundreds of other patients taking statin drugs. He also discovered that the side effects of statin drugs in general were both potentially serious and vastly underreported. They included elevated liver enzymes, muscle wasting, sexual dysfunction, and fatigue. He began digging a little deeper into the whole issue of statin drugs and heart disease. He started questioning some of the accepted notions about cholesterol, ideas he himself had once embraced wholeheartedly. For example, the idea that cholesterol causes heart disease and the idea that lowering cholesterol is one of the most important things you can do to protect your heart. I came to realize that cholesterol was in no way the heinous foe we had been led to believe it was, he wrote. Instead, I realized that cholesterol was the most important substance within our bodies, a substance without which life as we know it would simply cease to exist. That billions of dollars have been spent in an all-out war on a substance that is so fundamentally important to our health is undoubtedly one of the great scientific travesties of our era. Statin drugs and your sex life. And now for the part that no one is talking about, the dirty little secret about statin drugs. Please don't shoot the messengers. Ready? Statin drugs have an uncanny ability to completely mess up your sex life. No kidding. Not only is this a common side effect of cholesterol lowering, but it's also vastly underreported. And worst of all, many people who experience sexual dysfunction, especially men, have no idea that it might very well be related to the drug they're taking to lower their cholesterol. Erectile dysfunction affects more than half of all men between the ages of 40 and 70 years. We've already seen how lowering cholesterol can have serious consequences for memory, thinking, and mood. Just as the brain needs cholesterol for neurotransmitters to properly function, the gonads need it to produce the hormonal fuel to keep our sex lives humming. All the major sex hormones, testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen, come from cholesterol. It's utterly preposterous to assume that lowering cholesterol, which is tantamount to downsizing your body's own sex hormone factory, is not going to have a profound effect on sexual functioning. Of course it is. And it does. Several studies have shown beyond any doubt that statin drugs lead to a reduction in sex hormones, most notably testosterone. And this is a very big deal indeed. Remember, low testosterone is not just a male problem. Women also make testosterone, albeit much less of it. And it's increasingly clear that even this small amount of testosterone strongly influences women's sexual desire. Most anti-aging clinics now routinely prescribe small physiologic doses of testosterone to postmenopausal women to treat sagging libido levels and improve general well-being. Even though women have less of it than men do, testosterone is vitally important to both sexes. Statins for children? Dr. Sinatra will frequently prescribe a low-dose statin drug for people in this specific population. Middle-aged men who have already had a heart attack or have documented coronary artery disease. Both of us believe there is no other good use for statin drugs. There is virtually no good evidence to support their use in women. They do not need to be prescribed for people who have not had a heart attack. And they definitely, emphatically, positively should not be prescribed for children. We want to clarify this position once again, partly to help counteract the enormous lobbying efforts of the pharmaceutical companies, which, as of this writing, are working tirelessly to expand the market for statin drugs to include children. One of the worst ideas in history. In The End of Illness, author David Agus, MD, recommends that everyone in the country be on a statin drug. Agus is well-meaning but completely wrong. His idea, if accepted, may be the next medical disaster just waiting to happen. So a middle-aged man who has already had a first heart attack may indeed find that a statin drug, along with coenzyme Q10 and fish oil, fits into his overall treatment plan. Remember, the antioxidant and blood-thinning effects of a low-dose statin may afford some degree of protection in extremely vulnerable men who have had a previous heart attack or moderate to severe coronary disease. For anyone else, proceed with caution. Recently, the case has been made for low-dose statin therapy in cases of extremely elevated particle number. We know for sure that low cholesterol is linked to low testosterone in women from studies conducted on women with a condition known as polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. Women with PCOS suffer from an abnormal increase in their testosterone levels, but when you lower their cholesterol, their testosterone plummets, leaving little doubt about the anti-hormone effect of statin drugs. The effect on men is pretty easy to document, and many studies have done just that. One study showed that Crestor, one of the most popular statin drugs, increased the risk of erectile dysfunction at least 2 and up to 7 times. If libido and sexual health were the only things disturbed by diminishing levels of testosterone, that would be reason enough to be deeply concerned. But low testosterone has a much more global influence on overall health. Low testosterone is associated with decreased life expectancy as well as increased risk of mortality from cardiovascular disease. And for those who have diminished testosterone levels, the risk is doubled. Men, if you're over 50, it's a good idea to have your testosterone levels assessed by a physician familiar with age management medicine, such as the Cenegenics Medical Institute. The hormone of love. As important as it is, testosterone certainly isn't the only driver of sex and desire in either males or females. Another important hormone, known as the hormone of love, is oxytocin. Oxytocin is produced in the brain, and levels are very high during childbirth and nursing because one of its functions is to help the mother bond with the child. When you cuddle after sex, you're flooded with oxytocin. Males also make oxytocin, just a lot less of it than females do. Researchers love to study male prairie voles because they are a rare exception to the male-female oxytocin dichotomy. Male prairie voles, unlike males of most species, make a ton of the stuff. Male prairie voles are also a rare example of monogamy in the animal kingdom, and this has long been attributed to their oxytocin production, resulting in fairly permanent pair bondings. The bottom line is that oxytocin, which helps you feel good and bond with another person or another prairie vole, is an important part of human sexual desire, expression, and satisfaction. So what does oxytocin have to do with cholesterol? Well, unlike testosterone, oxytocin is not made from cholesterol. But oxytocin gets into its target organs via cell receptors, and those cell receptors are highly dependent on cholesterol-rich membranes. Critically important parts of the membranes, known as lipid rafts, don't work well without cholesterol, meaning that lowering cholesterol interferes with the ability of hormones such as oxytocin to reach their destination and work their magic. As we've seen, this also happens with neurotransmitters in the brain that depend on cholesterol-rich membranes for cellular communication. Finally, statins also interfere with serotonin receptors in the brain. In case you're not familiar with serotonin, it's one of the critical neurotransmitters involved in mood. The most commonly used antidepressants, including the blockbuster drugs Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, and the like, are known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, because they act mainly to keep serotonin hanging around the brain longer. Serotonin has a great deal to do with our feelings of relaxation, well-being, and satisfaction. So, how exactly do statins act on the physiology of serotonin? Simple. Much like oxytocin, serotonin depends on cell receptors to get into the cells. Serotonin receptors, just like oxytocin receptors, are anchored into the cholesterol-rich lipid rafts in the cell membrane. If you lower cholesterol, you're going to interfere with serotonin getting into the cells. It's that simple. In fact, research has convincingly demonstrated that serotonin receptors can be rendered dysfunctional by statin drugs. The noted French researcher Michel Delorgeril, MD, lead author on the Lion Diet Heart Study, is so strongly convinced that statins are screwing up our sex lives that he devoted an entire book to the subject. His only book in English, it offers a brilliant argument supported by 92 references from peer-reviewed journals and textbooks. The name of the book, A Near-Perfect Sexual Crime, Statins Against Cholesterol, pretty much tells you what Delorgeril thinks about statins and our sex lives. Statins and all-cause mortality. Earlier, we discussed how the majority of cholesterol-lowering studies didn't show any difference in death rates between patients who took cholesterol-lowering meds and patients who didn't. In some of these cases, a slight reduction in heart disease deaths was clearly offset by a slight increase in deaths from other causes. So the overall net gain in terms of lives saved was a big fat zero. But many studies show even more troubling results. For example, a study in the Journal of Cardiac Failure showed that low cholesterol was actually associated with a marked increase in mortality in heart failure cases. And the Italian longitudinal study on aging, published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, found that those with cholesterol levels lower than 189 were far more likely to die than those with the highest cholesterol levels. The researchers concluded subjects with low total cholesterol levels are at higher risk of dying even when many related factors have been taken into account, adding that physicians may want to regard very low levels of cholesterol as potential warning signs of occult disease or as signals of rapidly declining health. Statins, cancer, and diabetes. There are also troubling indications that statin drugs may be associated with a higher risk for cancer and diabetes. Researchers from the Department of Medicine at Tufts Medical Center and Tufts University School of Medicine examined 23 statin trials looking for any connection between cholesterol levels and cancer. They concluded that the risk of cancer is significantly associated with lower achieved LDL cholesterol levels, adding that the cardiovascular benefits of low achieved levels of LDL cholesterol may in part be offset by an increased risk of cancer. Statins can potentially promote cancer through a variety of mechanisms. One, through reductions in natural killer cell cytotoxicity, which, over time, decrease the body's immune response to tumor cells. Two, through increases in endothelial progenitor cells in the bone marrow, which are associated with invasive breast cancer and lymphoma, and can potentially feed tumors by supporting new blood vessel growth. And three, by increasing the numbers and functionality of regulatory T cells, which can impair the body's immune response against tumors and decrease the effectiveness of cancer immunotherapy. Even more disturbing, some individual statin trials have confirmed a potential cancer risk increase from statin therapy. In the prospective study of pravastatin in the elderly at risk, PROSPER, one of the only statin trials designed for elderly subjects, overall cancer incidence was significantly higher for participants taking pravastatin compared to a placebo. In fact, cancer rates went up so much that they canceled out the reduction in heart disease deaths, leaving overall mortality unchanged. For a deeper discussion of the PROSPER study, see Appendix A. Likewise, in the long-term intervention with pravastatin in ischemic disease lipid study, the elderly subgroup ages 65 to 75 taking pravastatin had significantly higher cancer incidence than the placebo group. Collectively, this suggests that elderly statin users might be especially susceptible to the cancer-promoting properties of these drugs. When it comes to diabetes, statins are also looking increasingly suspect. In a study published in Diabetes Care in 2014, a cohort of over 115,000 Italian residents, all freshly treated with statins during 2003 and 2004, were followed for about 7 years, with researchers tracking any subsequent diabetes diagnoses or treatment they received. By the end of the study, the more consistently the participants took their statins, the greater their risk of developing diabetes. The researchers wrote, "In a real-world setting, the risk of new-onset diabetes rises as adherence with statin therapy increases. In fact, compared to patients with very low adherence to the drug, those who took the drug religiously had a 32% greater risk of becoming diabetic." And dose matters. Higher potency statins were associated with an even greater risk of diabetes in one major Canadian study. Those who underwent high-dose statin therapy in a meta-analysis of 5 statin studies were found to have a significantly increased risk of diabetes. In another study, researchers found that statin use increased the risk of diabetes by a whopping 46%. Let us point out that as recently as 2018, Dr. Jennifer Ashton went on Good Morning America to defend the American Heart Association's astonishing recommendation that people take whatever high dose of statins is necessary to bring their LDL down to 70 or less. Let that sink in for a minute. The American Heart Association and its apologists literally recommend that you take however high a dose you need of a drug known to cause diabetes for the sole purpose of bringing down a number, LDL, that no longer matters. It would be funny if it weren't so sad. Considering that statins have been shown to reduce glucose tolerance, induce hyperglycemia, induce hyperinsulinemia, and change insulin secretion patterns in the pancreas, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that for some people, the end result is full-blown diabetes. As we've noted in Chapter 1, diabetes should really be considered pre-heart disease. Okay, so it's pretty clear that statin drug side effects are hardly uncommon. But if so many people have so many symptoms as a result of taking statin drugs, why, you might well ask, have you not heard about them? Don't doctors know about this stuff? Okay, we've answered the first question in our inquiry. What are the risks? Now it's time to take a look at the second question. What are the benefits? Only then can we make an intelligent decision about the risk-benefit ratio and decide whether it really makes sense to take or stay on a statin drug. Let's take a look at the evidence. The benefits of statin drugs. Not exactly what we've been led to believe. To understand how you may have been misled about the benefits of statin drugs, it'll be useful to first understand something about how it's possible to mislead by using percentages. Spoiler alert, if you want to make something sound better than it is, for example, the success rates for a drug, percentages are the way to go. We'll explain. Let's say you're on a game show, and you can choose between two prizes, both of which are a big pile of money, but you don't know how much. Here's the choice. You can have 10% of all the money behind door number 1, or you can have 90% of all the money behind door number 2. Which one do you choose? It's impossible to know what's the better deal without knowing the absolute number of dollars behind each door. Sure, all things being equal, 90% sounds a lot better than 10%, but you'd have to know how much money we're talking about to know if you made the right choice. After all, I'd rather have 1% of Warren Buffett's bank account than 90% of the average Americans. So, this is where drug companies get sleazy. Let's say a drug company advertises that their drug was shown to produce a 40% reduction in risk for a heart attack. Let's use some real numbers to show how misleading that can be, even though it sounds really good. As of this writing, Russia has the greatest rate of heart attacks of any country, 1,752 people for every 100,000. That means any given person has a 1.752% chance of getting a heart attack in any given year. Now, let's assume you didn't know that, but you're scared to death of a heart attack because there's heart disease in your family. You're offered a drug that has a lot of potential side effects, but your doctor, repeating the drug company's talking points, explains that this drug will reduce your risk of a heart attack by 25%. That's no small potatoes, and many of us would take a chance on side effects in order to reduce our risk of a heart attack by such a large percentage. But when you do the math and look at the actual numbers, here's what you get. Without the drug, you've got roughly a 1.75% chance of getting a heart attack. With the drug, your chance drops to, wait for it, 1.31% chance. Presented with the opportunity to take a drug with a lot of side effects in order to reduce your actual odds of getting a heart attack by less than 0.5%, many people might understandably say, "No thanks, Doc." The point is, you always want to know the actual numbers, whether it's the number of dollars you'll actually see at the end of the day or the number of patients who you'll actually help. Percentages are wildly misleading. A neuroscientist takes on the statin data. Let's look at one of the most stunning real-life examples of how relative risk tricked us into fearing cholesterol. This one's brought to us by David Diamond, a brilliant neuroscientist whose interest in cholesterol began after he was diagnosed with familial hypertriglyceridemia, a genetic condition that leads to dangerously high triglyceride levels. In his quest to get to the bottom of the heart disease and cholesterol confusion, Diamond decided to take a deeper dive into the research. He started with a highly influential study known as the Mr. Fit study, which is often used as evidence in favor of the conventional view on cholesterol and heart disease. The Mr. Fit study followed a whopping near 360,000 men at the time, the largest cohort of its kind, tracking the subject's cholesterol levels and risk of heart attack over the years. The paper's claims were bold, alarming, and enough to send anyone with even normal cholesterol levels into a panic. The analysis seemed to show that virtually any increase in blood cholesterol above 150 milligrams per deciliter was associated with an incrementally greater risk of death from heart disease. For every mere 1% increase in blood cholesterol, in fact, heart disease risk rose by 2%. In other words, it wasn't just folks with very high cholesterol that needed to worry. Pretty much everyone else who had a cholesterol over the ideal level was in trouble also. And when the folks with the highest cholesterol were compared to the folks with the lowest, those with levels greater than 290 milligrams per deciliter were at a 400% increased relative risk of keeling over from a heart attack. The researchers proclaimed their study proved that cholesterol powerfully affects risk for the great majority of middle-aged American men. If that doesn't make your doc whip out the prescription pad, we're not sure what will. Not surprisingly, the paper had a formidable impact on the nation's beliefs about cholesterol. Surely a study following that many people couldn't lead us astray. High cholesterol sure seemed like a bad actor. The logical conclusion from the study became the lower, the better, where cholesterol was concerned, an assumption that still lingers today, fueling doctors' aggressive attempts to push patients' levels as far down as pharmaceutically possible, and incidentally making the shareholders of Big Pharma crack open the bubbly. And that's why David Diamond wanted to see whether the study's alarmism stood on solid ground. Given how important we know cholesterol is for our body's basic survival, and what's more, how flimsy the cholesterol hypothesis of heart disease has proven to be, something seems fishy about such dramatic findings. So instead of trusting the relative risk that the researchers reported, Diamond wanted to know the absolute risk. How many people actually got heart attacks and died during the study? Which is exactly what you really want to know. So Diamond takes a fresh look at the Mr. Fit study and crunches the numbers, and the results speak for themselves. In an impressive reanalysis of the actual numbers, which he's presented in a number of recorded lectures, some of which are available on YouTube, Diamond showed that in each cholesterol bracket, the number of people who didn't develop heart disease and the number of people who did was nearly identical. Consider this. Among folks with rock-bottom cholesterol levels, 150 milligrams per deciliter, the kind of numbers most conventional docs would be delighted to see, 99.7% didn't die of heart disease and 0.3% did. Okay, sounds like really low cholesterol is a great goal, but compare those numbers to the group with really high cholesterol levels, 290 milligrams per deciliter and over, the kind of numbers that would drive a conventional doctor to drink. In the super high cholesterol group, fully 98.7% didn't die of heart disease, and a very slightly higher 1.3% did. That's right. The real absolute difference in risk between those with very low cholesterol and those with very high cholesterol was a mere 1%, the difference between 0.3 and 1.3. A lousy 1% difference in absolute risk across the entire range of cholesterol is what got everyone's knickers in a knot. Through the wizardry of statistics, the researchers were able to present those numbers as 400% increased risk of death from heart disease for people with the highest cholesterol. You see why this stuff is so tricky? The original paper's relative risk wasn't dishonest per se, but it certainly wasn't the kind of reporting that tells us the full story. And if it weren't for relentlessly investigative minds like Diamond's, we'd be none the wiser. All that being said, the Mr. Fit paper in question was published in 1986, a great many decades ago. Has its findings, as ultimately unimpressive as they are, held up over time? Is having very low cholesterol levels really even a tiny boon for heart disease mortality? The answer appears to be a resounding no. In 2016, an even bigger analysis published in the American Heart Association's journal Circulation, this time following more than 1,250,000 statins-free veterans between the years 2002 and 2007, successfully called Mr. Fit's bluff. While folks with the highest cholesterol levels still had a higher risk for heart disease, this study found that folks with low cholesterol were in trouble too. Those with cholesterol under 180 milligrams per deciliter had more deaths from heart disease than those with cholesterol all the way up to 240 milligrams per deciliter. Imagine if, way back in the 1980s, we'd been told that low cholesterol was just as bad as high cholesterol, and that having normal cholesterol of, say, 175 milligrams per deciliter actually put you at a greater heart disease risk than having a high cholesterol of 235 milligrams per deciliter. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Fuzzy math, anyone? Now let's see how the drug companies use the same deceptive relative numbers, percentages, rather than patients, to mislead you about the effects of their drugs. The makers of Lipitor, for example, famously advertised a 36% reduction in heart attack risk in their magazine ads. But read the fine print. It's a relative number. Here's how they compute it. Let's say you have 100 randomly chosen men who are not taking medications. And let's say that out of that 100, it's statistically likely that 3 of them would be expected to experience a heart attack at some point over the course of 5 years. In other words, 3% of the total number of men, 100, would be normally expected to have a heart attack over the course of 60 months. The actual numbers in the study were slightly different, resulting in the 36% claim, but for purposes of clarity, let's just round it out to 33%. Now, if you would put those same men on Lipitor over the course of the same 5 years, it turns out that instead of 3 men having a heart attack, only 2 would, 2% of the total number of men. A reduction from 3 heart attacks to 2 heart attacks is in fact a 33 1/3% reduction in relative risk. 1 is obviously 1/3 of the number 3. But so what? The real absolute number of heart attacks prevented is only 1. 1 heart attack among 100 men over the course of 5 years. The real absolute reduction in risk is 1%, the difference between the 3% in the no-drug group who would have had a heart attack and the 2% in the Lipitor group. The 33% reduction figure is, again, a relative number. And because it's way more impressive than the much more truthful 1%, the absolute number, researchers frequently choose to use relative risk instead of absolute risk when they report results. Would you take a drug for 5 years with all the potential side effects reported if you knew that it would reduce your chance of a heart attack by just 1%? Probably not, right? Which is exactly why the advertisements would tout 1/3 reduction in heart attacks or 33% less risk. The drug companies may be avaricious, but they're not stupid. Worth noting, the fine print in that famous Lipitor ad did indeed admit that what really happened was heart attacks went from 3% to 2%. You can see the original ad online, complete with fine print, by checking Google Images for Lipitor reduces heart attack risk by 36%. By the way, the aforementioned neuroscientist, Dr. David Diamond, worked his wizardry on that same Lipitor study. He created a graph to show the difference between the people treated with Lipitor and the people who got a placebo. On the graph, one sees 2 large bars, one in gray, one in black, that, if you squint, look like they are the exact same height. And that's because, for all intents and purposes, they are. The bars show the percentage of people in the study that did not get a heart attack. They show that in the placebo group, 97% of the people did not get one, while in the Lipitor group, 98.1% did not. When you see these bars side by side, it shows how truly minor the effect was. Lipitor basically reduced the percentage of people getting heart attacks by 1.1%. Keep this in mind when you read our review of some of the studies used to promote the idea that statins save lives. There's a second concept that would be helpful to understand before we venture into the studies themselves, and that's the distinction between primary prevention and secondary prevention. Primary prevention refers to treating people who have not had a heart attack for the purpose of preventing one. Secondary prevention refers to treating people who've already had a heart attack for the purpose of preventing another. As you'll soon see, the effects of statins on these two populations is quite different. Before we get to that, there's something else you should know about study interpretation in general that may help you make more sense of some of the statin propaganda. Studies usually produce a mass of data that can be spun in a number of ways. Let's take one common substance we're all familiar with: alcohol. There are no shortages of studies demonstrating that moderate alcohol consumption is associated with a slightly lower risk of heart disease. So far, so good. But those same studies have also teased out a troubling connection. Alcohol consumption increases the risk for breast cancer. Both facts, that alcohol helps your heart and that alcohol increases the risk for breast cancer, are absolutely true. But if you're a manufacturer of alcoholic beverages, you're going to be talking up the reduction in heart disease risk and not calling attention to the association with breast cancer. In much the same way, a drug company-sponsored study might indeed find a beneficial effect on heart disease associated with a particular drug, a beneficial effect similar to that of alcohol. But if in addition to lowering the risk of heart disease, the drug increased the risk for diabetes, a finding that's shown up in a couple of statin drug studies, the connection to diabetes might easily be buried in the text where only the most determined investigators would be likely to uncover it. At this point, in the first edition of this book, we went on a bit of a rampage, taking apart the sacred cow studies of the cholesterol establishment while bringing to light many of the studies that refute their conclusions. The positive studies, those showing a statistical benefit, are used by the same drug companies to support the idea that statin drugs prevent heart attacks. Sometimes they claim by as much as 36%, and that statin drugs save lives. In the original book, we went over these studies, including the ALL-HAT study, the Ascot LLA trial, the Japanese lipid intervention trial, the PROSPER trial, and the infamous JUPITER study, in great detail, exposing faulty methodology and unjustified conclusions whenever they occurred, and they occurred frequently. But that was 10 years ago, and detail that might seem mind-numbing and tedious today was needed then to expose the real flaws in the cholesterol hypothesis. We've decided to take a different approach in this edition, largely to save those who don't really care about the methodological minutiae and statistical details and would rather just get to the conclusions. We feel you. But for those of you who are interested in the details of the hows and whys and misleading statistics, we've included the detailed analyses of all these studies in Appendix A. Those who want to can nerd out on the numbers all they like, and the cut-to-the-chase crowd can break out the kazoos and keep reading, because here's the executive what-you-need-to-know summary of the case for statin drugs. In the ALL-HAT study, there was ultimately no difference in the death rate from heart attacks between the statin-treated group and the no-statin group. Not a single life was saved by statins. The Ascot LLA study was the one that allowed Lipitor to claim that their drug lowered the risk of heart disease by 36%. But for all the bragging, 100 mil was spent on the study and not a single life was saved. What's more, critics of the study pointed out a trend toward higher rates of heart failure, diabetes, and kidney impairment in the Lipitor-treated group. The heart protection study, which claimed massive benefits for a statin drug, actually produced a 1.8% difference in 5-year survival rates between the statin and non-statin group. And that benefit was completely independent of LDL cholesterol, meaning lowering cholesterol had nothing to do with it. The PROSPER study showed a slight reduction in heart attacks and strokes, but a slight increase in cancer. And again, no change in overall mortality. Finally, in the famous JUPITER trial that proclaimed a 50% reduction in risk of heart attacks, the actual risk went from 1.8% in the placebo group to 0.9% in the statin group, and the statin group had higher rates of diabetes. For those who want more details, please go to the appendix. The bottom line is that the body of evidence for the overwhelming benefit of statins is, well, underwhelming at best. The darker side of cholesterol lowering. Now, if you're still on the cholesterol lowering / statin bandwagon, you might be forgiven for trying to look on the bright side. Look, we can almost hear you saying, maybe you guys are right. Maybe lowering cholesterol doesn't matter all that much, but clearly there are some good things statins do besides lower cholesterol, as you yourselves have pointed out. They're anti-inflammatory, they're powerful antioxidants, and they thin the blood. So what's the harm if people take them? Fair enough. For some people, especially middle-aged men who've already had a first heart attack, the good statins do may indeed outweigh the risks. But the problem is twofold. One, statins are being prescribed left and right to people who have absolutely no business being on them, and to populations for which they have shown no real benefit. Two, the risks are significant, serious, varied, and highly underpublicized. Before we get to our evaluation of the risks and benefits of statin drugs, let's review exactly what it is that cholesterol does in the first place, Understanding the functions of this much maligned molecule will help you understand why so many things can go wrong when we pursue lower and lower cholesterol numbers. Cholesterol is a hormone factory. Cholesterol is actually the parent molecule for the whole family of hormones known as steroid hormones. These hormones include cortisol, known as the fight-or-flight hormone, and the entire family of sex steroids, including estrogens, progesterones, and testosterone. No wonder statins produce such serious sexual side effects. What about plaque? Okay, so maybe statin drugs don't cut the risk of dying, except possibly in middle-aged men with previous histories of heart disease, and even then the effect is modest. But what about plaque? Doesn't aggressive lowering of LDL cholesterol at least reduce plaque? Well, no. A study published in the American Journal of Cardiology in 2003 used electron beam tomography to evaluate plaque in 182 patients after 1.2 years of treatment with either statins alone or statins in conjunction with niacin. And yes, just like in many other studies, cholesterol did indeed go down in those patients treated with cholesterol-lowering medication. But plaque? Sorry. The authors wrote, despite the greater improvement in cholesterol numbers, there were no differences in calcified plaque progression. In fact, subjects in both groups had, on average, a 9.2% increase in plaque buildup. With respect to LDL cholesterol lowering, lower is better is not supported by changes in calcified plaque progression, concluded the authors. Cholesterol is used by the body to synthesize bile acids. Bile acids are vitally important for the digestion of fat. The acids are synthesized from cholesterol and then secreted into the bile. Bile acids are so important to the body that the body holds on to most of them. It keeps them from being lost in the feces by causing them to be reabsorbed from the lower intestine, put into a kind of metabolic recycling container, and taken back to the liver. Still, even with its best efforts, the body loses some bile acids. To make up for this, the liver synthesizes approximately 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of new cholesterol a day. That's about 7 to 10 times the amount in a large egg. Clearly, the body thinks you need that cholesterol. Cholesterol is an essential component of all the cell membranes in the body. It's especially important to the membranes of the brain, the nervous system, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. It's incorporated into the myelin sheath, a kind of insulation or cover to the nerve fibers that facilitates nerve impulse transmission. And, as we've already seen, cholesterol is an integral part of the lipid raft, essentially allowing for cellular communication. That's why there are so many cognitive problems associated with aggressive cholesterol lowering. Cholesterol is also important for stabilizing cells against temperature changes. Cholesterol is important for the immune system. Cholesterol has an important connection to the immune system. Research has shown that human LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, is able to inactivate more than 90% of the worst and most toxic bacterial products. A number of studies have linked low cholesterol to a greater risk of infections. One review of 19 large peer-reviewed studies of more than 68,000 deaths found that low cholesterol predicted an increased risk of dying from respiratory and gastrointestinal diseases, which frequently have an infectious origin. Another study that followed more than 100,000 healthy individuals in San Francisco found that those who had low cholesterol at the beginning of the 15-year study were far more likely to be admitted to the hospital because of an infectious disease. And an interesting finding from the Mr. Fit study showed that 16 years after their cholesterol was first checked, the group of men whose cholesterol level was 160 milligrams per deciliter or lower was 4 times more likely to die from AIDS than the group of men whose cholesterol was higher than 240 milligrams per deciliter. We make vitamin D from cholesterol. It's almost impossible to overstate how important the cholesterol-vitamin D connection is. Vitamin D, which is actually a hormone, not a vitamin, is made from cholesterol in the body. If you lower cholesterol indiscriminately, it stands to reason that you may negatively affect vitamin D levels. And that's hardly insignificant. Virtually every health practitioner worth his or her salt will tell you that massive numbers of people in the United States, and probably the world, have less than optimal vitamin D levels. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, only 33% of the U.S. population is at risk for either vitamin D inadequacy or vitamin D deficiency. But the levels considered sufficient are still being debated, and sufficient is hardly optimal. In 2010, the Life Extension Foundation conducted a survey of its members, a self-selected sample of people who really care about these things and pay particular attention to their health, blood tests, and supplementation, and found that even in this highly health-conscious population, a whopping 85% had blood tests with vitamin D levels below 50 nanograms per milliliter, considered the low end of optimal, 50 to 80 nanograms per milliliter. Why does this matter? Because there is compelling research that links less than optimal levels of vitamin D with heart disease, poor physical performance, osteoporosis, depression, cancer, difficulty in losing weight, and even all-cause mortality. Vitamin D is so important that Dr. Gregory Plotnikoff, medical director of the Penny George Institute for Health and Healing, Abbott Northwestern Hospital in Minnesota, recently commented, "Because vitamin D is so cheap and so clearly reduces all-cause mortality, I can say this with great certainty. Vitamin D represents the single most cost-effective medical intervention in the United States." Undoubtedly, there are multiple reasons why so many people are walking around with suboptimal levels of vitamin D, not the least of which is that we are so darn sun-phobic that we now slather SPF 90 on our skin just to go to the grocery store. But is it a coincidence that vitamin D deficiencies and insufficiencies are showing up all over the place at the same time that 11 million to 30 million Americans are on statin drugs, the purpose of which is to lower the very molecule that gives birth to this vitally important nutrient? An overall health benefit of zero. A few years ago, John Abramson, MD, author of Overdosed America, analyzed 8 randomized trials that compared statin drugs with placebos. His findings and conclusions were published in a column in The Lancet. Here's what he wrote. Our analysis suggests that statins should not be prescribed for true primary prevention in women of any age or for men older than 69 years. Dr. Abramson's conclusions echo the findings and recommendations of the researchers at Therapeutics Initiative, a kind of consumer reports on drug industry studies that was started in 1994 at the University of British Columbia. Therapeutics Initiative, which is wholly independent of government and big pharma, evaluated 5 of the major statin trials, including some we talk about in the appendix, and concluded that total mortality, that is, the number of people who actually died, was not impacted by statin therapy, and that statins have not been shown to provide an overall health benefit in primary prevention trials. Emphasis ours. Statins, a final cautionary note. Millions of Americans will be taking statin drugs for decades, as recommended by the National Cholesterol Education Program's NCEP guidelines, and long-term side effects will become apparent, creating a whole host of pathologic situations. What does all this confusion and controversy mean to practicing physicians and the patients for whom they care? Dietary factors and therapeutic lifestyle changes have no side effects. They should be considered the first line of defense in preventive cardiology. Look, there's not much doubt that statin therapy can reduce the incidence of coronary morbidity and mortality for those who are at great risk of developing coronary artery disease. But as research continues to implicate inflammation as the major coronary risk factor, cholesterol recommendations by groups such as the NCEP need to be modified. We're chasing the wrong villain, as you'll see in the coming chapters. Ultimately, hopefully, the attention paid to cholesterol will wind up being proportional to its importance as a causative factor in heart disease, which is to say, not much. Rather than selecting treatment options as a technician or a computer would do and targeting cholesterol numbers alone, doctors owe it to their patients and patients owe it to themselves to look further into these controversial issues before embracing potent drugs that might not truly serve the needs of the people for whom they're being prescribed. Although the use of statins in high-risk coronary patients, especially those with inflammatory markers, might be good medicine right now, overuse of these potent pharmacologic agents that have both known and unknown side effects for long-term use in otherwise healthy people is simply not justifiable. What you need to know. The benefits of statin drugs have been widely exaggerated, and any benefit of these drugs has little to do with their ability to lower cholesterol. Statin drugs deplete coenzyme Q10, one of the most important nutrients for the heart. Depletion of CoQ10 can cause muscle pain, weakness, and fatigue. Statin drugs lead to a reduction in sex hormones, as shown by several studies. Sexual dysfunction is a common but underreported side effect of statin drugs. There are troubling indicators that statin drugs may be associated with a higher risk for cancer and diabetes. Statins should not be prescribed for the elderly or for the vast majority of women, and they should never be prescribed for children. Chapter 9. The real cause of heart disease. We've all heard about the apparently healthy person with no history of heart disease and no known risk factors who suddenly drops dead of a heart attack at age 47 while running